I'm not entirely sure where to start, if I'm being honest. I mean, it's one of those disorders where, since it's lifelong, there isn't really exactly a start. I was diagnosed in roughly the first couple of months of 2020. I don't have an exact date because unfortunately that's how DID works, is you tend to lose time and such. But DID being a complex trauma disorder, it doesn't stem from one event. Essentially, how it works is, as a child, roughly usually under the age of 6, you have to experience repeated or severe trauma in order to develop the disorder. Trauma so severe that actually your brain thinks, I won't survive this if I can't remember it. So with DID, there is not really one main event. I mean, the earliest memory I have is I was 3 or 4 in the car with my dad, and he had granola bars or something, and I was hungry. We'd been driving for a while, but instead of giving me a granola bar, he reached into the center console and handed me a handful of dog treats. This was actually a really common occurrence. And speaking about it, doesn't really sound like I have a lot of emotion for it, because that's what DID tends to do. You know it happened, but it takes all of the memories and the emotions away from these traumatic events that caused it. So if I were to look at this event from an outside perspective and think, oh, if this happened to the little girl down the street, would I be outraged? Would I be horrified? Absolutely. But when I think about it in terms of myself, it just kind of is. It's like when you read a history book about World War I or something, and it doesn't resonate with you in the way that something that you would have experienced does. It's just kind of words on a page. And that's kind of what DID does. There's a lot of focus, I think, on alters, which is actually why they changed the diagnosis back in the 90s, is they changed it to dissociative identity disorder instead of multiple personality disorder, because there had been way too much focus on the concept of alters, and it had become kind of a spectacle. At the end of the day, it's more about the trauma than anything. If I'm remembering correctly off the top of my head, the average diagnostic process takes roughly 7 years. So from the start of any sort of mental health counseling to 7 years later is roughly when somebody with DID will be diagnosed. For me, it took about 12 years. I actually went to therapy for the first time when I was 9 for my parents' divorce, which ended up kind of segueing into anger issues therapy. And I was in therapy for that until I was roughly 11. I didn't actually ever get diagnosed with anything during that time, but it's kind of a commonality between all of those things, that all of the therapy that I did, that I was consistently misdiagnosed. When I was about that age, when I was 9, was actually my first suicide attempt. I don't remember why. I couldn't tell you the events that led up to it. It's just one of those things that I remember in a very detached manner. For me, DID is the proof that I survived what happened to me. It's the proof that, my body said, I can't survive this, but then I did. It's not a bad thing when I look at it. It affects my whole life. Every aspect of my life, from job prospects to school to doctor's appointments and social lives, are affected. But at the end of the day, I survived, and that's what really matters to me. But yeah, so I went through a lot of therapy as a kid. From the ages of 9 to 11, I was in therapy for my parents' divorce. And then actually at 12, I was diagnosed with autism, which should have been obvious earlier. I was actually being bullied for being autistic for years and years. And that's one of those things that can actually cause DID. You wouldn't think about it, but being bullied at a very, very young age, depending on the severity of it, can absolutely cause it. Once I was diagnosed with autism, I had pretty major depression at that point, so I was also being treated for that. Well, I say treated. My therapist didn't actually know how to treat depression, so she kind of treated it as an oh, you're sad today kind of thing. Once I moved into high school, the bullying actually got a lot worse. I switched high schools from my middle school. Everybody in my middle school went to a town middle school, and I ended up going to a separate high school because of everything that had happened to me growing up. I decided that I didn't want to be with those people anymore. And unfortunately, the bullying got worse to the point that I started having severe anxiety around the age of probably 14. The best way I guess I can put it is I started acting erratically. When I got mad, I would kind of lose time in the way that, when you're driving a car and you're driving a really familiar route and you realize that you don't remember the last 10 minutes or so of driving. You know where you went through, or you vaguely kind of have an idea. I started having these periods of not really remembering, but having an idea of what I was doing. And one of the things that actually happened during those little periods is because I was being bullied, I guess I started to defend myself. And for whatever reason, I would actually slip into an accent at that time. People pointed it out to me, but I was 15 and I was like, I don't know, that's weird. I don't know why I do it. I'm not meaning to do it and I don't really remember doing it, but I guess I do it. And honestly, that should have been my first, realization that there was something wrong, is that I was losing this time and speaking in an accent from, a region that I'm not even from. And so I started having these anxiety and panic attacks around that time because the bullying at that school got so bad that I was sexually assaulted. I didn't remember it, so all I knew is that I was having these extreme panic attacks. And I couldn't do things like go to the gym or sit for too long in my classes without just my heart racing and sweating, and pretty much every symptom you can experience with a panic attack I started experiencing. And that's when I actually started being treated for PTSD. That is probably the closest diagnosis I got to having the DID diagnosis while I was still a kid. After I was sexually assaulted at that school, I switched back to the high school that I was originally supposed to go to. Nothing really of note happened there until my senior year, when I started hearing things. At the time, I was absolutely panicking. I was so worried that I was developing schizophrenia or something. In my family history, we had a couple of people that we don't even know the names of that were admitted to asylums in the 40s and 50s. So I have no idea what that medical history could be. So I was constantly afraid that I was developing schizophrenia. And I actually brought it up to one of the counselors at the school that I was experiencing this voice inside my head that obviously at this point I know now are alters, but at the time I had absolutely no idea. And she actually told me to stop pretending. She told me that I was, trying to vie for attention, that I was acting out, because clearly I wasn't getting enough attention at the home. This woman was absolutely awful, and I have about 1 million more stories about her. But what really mattered at that point was that I was beginning to have the symptoms of when you have dissociative identity disorder. A lot of times when you come into what your mind interprets as a safer space, it starts relaxing those, trauma responses. So with a DID, a lot of times, until you know and are fully aware that you are a DID system, a lot of time you won't actually have any idea. You won't have any symptoms. You won't hear any alters. You won't remember any of the times in which they've fronted. It's kind of just this living your life without knowing that other people are also living it, which for me, once I started hearing these voices of other alters, kind of started a very, very slow spiral to me actually getting my diagnosis. So I suppose in the end, it was probably a good thing.
Can you explain what the word fronting means? You used that before.
So with DID, alters tend to not be aware of the world a lot of the time. And depending on how many alters you have, you could be aware of the world very, very little of the time. So when an alter is aware of the world and actively controlling the body of the system, so in my case, my body, that would be called fronting. So any alter who is not currently in the body or aware of, what is happening in my life is not fronting. So it's kind of like this mystical word that basically means, am I aware of what's happening right now? And if I'm not, then I'm not there.
Do these alters have unique memories of their own experiences when fronting?
Yeah, actually. So for us, we experience what we refer to as gray out amnesia. And that means that anytime that an alter is not fronting, they really experience everything in the sense of that, coming back to that driving analogy, they really experience everything in that sort of, well, I've been driving for 10 minutes, but I have no idea exactly where I am or exactly where I went. So a lot of times when an alter fronts, say like after we've gone grocery shopping, they won't know what we've gotten or might not even know what grocery store we went to, just that we went out of the house. So alters end up having a lot of their own memories in that regard.
So they'll kind of fill in what they need to know.
Yeah, a lot of it is really just guesswork, which can make a lot of things like daily life very difficult, and knowledge does not transfer from alter to alter. Referencing scientific research here, they actually did, I'm not sure the technical word for it, but brain scans on some people with DID, and they found that different alters actually have fully different patterns of electrical activity in the brain. It's really exciting to hear this kind of new news because it means they get, closer and closer to fully understanding the disorder.
And people also must have a lot harder time denying it when there's scientific papers about it,
You'd be surprised. You'd be very surprised. I mean, it's like that with a lot of science. Vaccines, there's still going to be vaccine deniers. So, at the end of the day, there's still going to be people who look at me and they say, well, you're clearly faking this for attention. And at first, when I found out I was a system, that really affected me. But now at this point, it's just, I don't really care if you think I'm faking it for attention, because at the end of the day, it doesn't affect my life whether somebody who doesn't have a medical degree thinks I'm faking. What matters is that my doctors know, and I know, and, my support system knows.
And your doctors are all very confirming for you?
Yeah, I was really lucky. That actually kind of feeds back into that whole little therapy timeline I had going on there. I went to college, and this was the first time I ever got to choose a therapist for myself. I was very excited, and it did not go well at all. So what I've learned is I'm not great at choosing therapists. So I went to college, and I chose a therapist for myself for the first time, and I was so desperate to prove to my parents that I could make my own decisions that I stuck with this therapist for 2 years. She misdiagnosed me with bipolar 1 because I was extremely depressed at the time, so I was actually going into these like catatonic dissociative depressive states where I was just not even aware of the world around me, and I wouldn't move for a couple of hours at a time. I know now that I was, alters were switching in and out, so I would go from this like extremely dissociated depressive state to super hyper excited, babbling on. And, when you don't have all of the clues, that does look a lot like bipolar. So I ended up being medicated for bipolar for those full 2 years, I think. And the medication didn't do anything because antipsychotics aren't going to fix PTSD. So the medication didn't really do anything. And then finally, I realized that this therapy was going nowhere, and the therapist I chose wasn't listening to what I had to say. And I actually, for a very short period of time, kind of gave up on therapy altogether. I knew there was something very clearly wrong with me because I was having all of these issues with my mental health with, these appearing to be manic episodes, but also losing time, which actually became more and more prominent in college. When I was in high school, I only had like 20 people in my graduating class. And so when I went to college and I had like 1,000 people on campus at any given point, I knew who all my friends were, and I didn't know everybody on campus. And so sometimes I would be walking down the street and somebody would come up to me and they would say my name. And they would say, oh, hey, we were supposed to go do X, Y, and Z. And I had no idea who they were. Like, clearly they knew who I was, but I had never, in my experience, met them before in my life. So I was having these constant symptoms of DID without actually having a name for it. And what ended up happening in that period in which I decided that I was going to give up on therapy forever is I ended up on a small Discord server for what is called the plurality community. I didn't really understand it a whole lot at the time, but essentially the plurality community is a group of people who believe that anybody can give themselves not DID, but a DID system. So alters. There's obviously been proof at this point that this is not actually scientifically correct. You can't give yourself alters, and DID doesn't form for no reason. But this community, which actually formed in like the late 90s, early 2000s as a form of demedicalization from DID, I stumbled into them when I was roughly 20 or so. And I actually stumbled into them through a friend. And I, threw all my symptoms on the board and something stuck. And, these people looked at me and they were like, it's okay. You have a system. You have alters. That's what this is. And it was the first time that I realized that my symptoms weren't like 10 different disorders all at once. It was just one thing. And for a while there, I felt really, really welcomed into this little community online. But things change, and I started seeing a new therapist. And I didn't actually mention any of this to her because I wanted to bring it up later after she actually knew me for a while so that I could get her genuine opinion on it, having treated me for a little while. I saw her for probably around 6 months before I brought up. I was like, hey, I think I have this thing. It's called dissociative identity disorder. And she looked me in the eye and she said, well, yeah. And I was like, what do you mean? Well, yeah. I was like, we've been talking to each other for like 6 months. And she was like, yeah, you like she couldn't diagnose me because of her specific qualifications, but she was like, I'm almost 100% certain that you have this disorder.
Okay, so I'm currently editing this video, and while watching through it with Zenith, they believe that they actually switched in this moment from one of the alters, Avery, to another, Callie. So if you see some slight changes in mannerisms or tone, that would be why.
And having a medical professional look at my symptoms and recognize them for actually what they are was incredible. Like, I can't tell you how much it meant for somebody to look at me and tell me that I wasn't crazy. It was all in my head, like technically, mental illness and all that. But, I wasn't making it up. I wasn't acting up for attention. She looked at me and she was like, I believe you. So I went back to that little plurality community, and I was really excited because I had finally gotten this, this medical professional to recognize my symptoms. And I went back to this plurality community and I said, hey, I talked to my doctor and she's pretty sure I have DID. And that's when it all started to go downhill. The problem with the plurality community is, as I said earlier, it was started in the early 2000s by people who are diagnosed with DID in attempts to fully demedicalize DID. And at this point, it's, it took on a mind of its own, as things on the internet tend to do. And now the idea is less demedicalize DID and more anybody can have DID. And so when I told these friends that I had made that I had DID, for me it was a really exciting moment. For them, they saw it as me betraying them in some way. So I actually had to turn DMs off for anybody but friends for a while because I was receiving threats and messages. The plurality community has this word that they call people with DID, and it's called trauma scum. So I was getting a lot of people messaging me, calling me trauma scum, and sometimes sending me, gore pictures and stuff. And I never really brought it up with my friends at the time because I was worried that I was overplaying it. Like it was, I was making it way bigger than it was actually. But obviously, in retrospect, it was just that bad. So I ended up fully leaving that community. I found out a couple of months later, actually, that the whole purpose of that community, you hear the word demedicalize and you don't realize the amount of damage it can cause, because if DID is fully demedicalized, I lose my insurance coverage, which some people can afford, but for people with DID, a lot of times we can't afford appointments and stuff. And, if you refuse to give a depressed person treatment, you can kind of see where that would end. So this whole goal to demedicalize DID, I found out, was actively harming people. So I actually pulled fully away from that community at that point. And the therapist that I was seeing at that time, because she couldn't properly diagnose me and I was leaving college, she referred me to a trauma specialist in the area that I was moving to. And that kind of brings us all the way back up to March or April or whatever month of early 2020 when I finally got to see the trauma therapist and I actually got my diagnosis. And you wouldn't really think that, especially since you've lived with it your whole life, something as small as diagnostic papers can change everything. But all of a sudden, I was able to get accommodations at work, and I was able to receive like constant support wherever I was going. I could bring my diagnosis to my medical doctors, like my primary care practitioner, and they looked into it and they started to, they understood what was happening to me and everything. And so getting this diagnosis really just changed how I lived my day-to-day life. I started being able to work on coping skills and break down these dissociative barriers that separate alters. Now I have, kind of rudimentary communication because I've only been in therapy for specifically DID for like 2 years at this point, but I can still communicate with my alters, and we know each other's names now, and, names and ages, because not every alter is the same age. A lot of alters get stuck in the age of trauma, basically. So an age that we were traumatized at. So we have alters as young as 5, and then some alters will appear older because what was needed was a parental figure or something such like that. So we have alters as old as 40. And this is all in a 24-year-old body, so it can get really confusing. And a lot of the time I actually forget my own age. So, I'll go to, let's say, like the liquor store or something, to pick up drinks for a party, and they'll ask me my age to verify it on my ID. And I have to just sit there for like 40, 50 seconds and just be like, when was I born? Like, what's my date of birth? Because everybody in the system kind of feels a different age, and we can't just say like, oh, I'm 26, and then have it be like fully wrong and then get my ID confiscated. So once I actually got my diagnosis, I was able to start breaking down those dissociative barriers. And one of the things that actually came from it is, I said we have really young alters, and unfortunately with DID, you don't really have a whole lot of control about when those alters switch in. So at a couple of jobs that I've had in the past, we have had some of the younger ones switch in due to triggers. Like one of the younger ones immediately switches in if there's thunder, which is something that really haven't been able to figure out a way to solve yet. But it tends to be really dangerous to all of a sudden have 5-year-old in the body of a 24-year-old at a pizza parlor, working with the oven and everything. So I ended up being able to get a whole bunch of accommodations that allowed me to step away and allowed me to take some space so that the younger alters could, do their best to try and bring an older one forward. It has led to a couple of funny situations. Like, as a whole now, we tend to identify as a lesbian, but that wasn't always the case. So we have had female attracted alters come out at very unfortunate times, which can lead to like very, very uncomfortable situations that aren't great in the moment, but in retrospect are kind of hilarious. But yeah, it's one of those things, and it won't ever go away, because DID changes the way your brain develops. So I won't ever not have DID, but we can learn how to manage it and try and learn new coping skills so that we don't end up with newer alters. Because anytime a traumatic event happens, we can actually, it's called splitting an alter. And essentially what happens is a new alter is kind of created to hold that traumatic memory or the stress of a situation or whatever. And so for people with DID, sometimes you'll see systems that have like lots and lots of alters. Like there's one in Australia. She made the news for her alters being legally recognized in a lawsuit against her abuser, and she had over 1,000 alters, which I can't even imagine. We've got like 20 something, and it's already so difficult to manage. But, once you've got the diagnosis, you can start working on making it so that you won't end up with any more alters, so that you can kind of start slowing down and working on better coping mechanisms to handle these stressful, traumatic situations.
Is there anyone you care about in your life that doesn't recognize this as real?
There's actually a lot of people that I haven't told for that fear. I've been really lucky that everybody that I have kept in my life has sort of taken a look at me and said, I believe you. When I was in college, I started making the effort to let my friends know, because a lot of the time I worked with them on projects and they had noticed that I wouldn't quite remember things super well. like tasks I needed to do or whatever. And specifically, I remember pulling one of my friends aside in the dining hall at one point to a corridor offset of the dining hall.
Quick note, this is a change from Callie to Spencer now, if you notice a change in tone or speaking patterns.
And said, "Hey, I have something I need to tell you, and I'm worried that you're gonna look down on me for it." And he was like, what is it? Like, I don't think there's a whole lot you could do that, I would look down at you for. And I told him I have dissociative identity disorder, and that's why I forget things a lot, is because I have alters. And he looked me in the eye and he said, "I don't think any less of you." And that has always stuck with me, because at that time I had already told a couple of friends, and they'd taken it well, kind of offhand, like just accepting, but like not really putting too much thought into like their responses, just being like, "Oh, okay, that's cool, that's fine." But it was the first time that anybody had said anything like that to me, and it is stuck with me to this day ever since. And I know he's gonna watch this video, so thanks, man. Yeah, so we've actually avoided telling our family about the diagnosis. Only in the more recent years has our mother started even considering therapy for herself. And while she didn't take any of previous therapy or previous diagnoses in my life, badly, it's a very stigmatized disorder, and we're kind of afraid to tell specifically our family just due to that, because we've already cut off our father. And so, we haven't spoken to him in 2 to 4 years, somewhere around there. I don't really want to lose any more family. So we haven't had anybody outright reject us, but we've also been very, very careful with who we tell.
What do you think of people that diagnose themselves with DID, kind of say they have it without a medical professional?
I don't really think I'm one to judge, because the first time I ever heard of DID, I didn't hear about it from a medical professional. And while my therapist at the time had, without me knowing, figured it out, I had to bring it up to her myself. And so I think at the end of the day, if you do your research and you do, actively eventually want to seek diagnosis, I don't think that resources should be denied to you to manage your condition, whether it be DID or not. A lot of people who do self-diagnose with DID, it ends up being something different.
If someone thinks they have DID, what are the steps they should take?
I mean, specifically with DID, it tends to be a very complex disorder to try and figure out if you have yourself. My personal recommendation would be to just start leaving notes everywhere, if you can, and if you're in a safe environment. That's how I was able to start breaking down that dissociative barrier between alters, as I would leave both physical notes. I had a journal I kept on me at all times, and I also had a Discord server. So I really kind of covered all of the bases there. But the best thing you can do is start looking into how to break down those communication barriers, try and match up the symptoms, and don't try and process the trauma yourself. That can go very poorly, and it is unfortunately very easy to re-traumatize yourself. So ideally, people who are concerned they might have DID should really just do their best to try and get a therapist or a medical professional, specifically one that deals in trauma. But if that isn't possible, just try and start taking those steps to break down those dissociative barriers. I will admit that I don't think we intended to switch mid-recording, so I'm very sorry about that. Yeah, we have a fair few alters in our system, but Avery started the recording. There might have actually been 2 switches in there. Sometimes it's difficult to tell until afterwards, because when alters come to the front, there can be kind of varying levels, so you can be like fully in the body, vaguely aware, or not even there. So sometimes switches are a little hard to tell, but Avery started the recording, and maybe Callie did. I'm not really sure.
Well, you did a fantastic job of flowing right through it.
Thank you, I guess. I don't know if I can take the credit for that. At the end of the day, DID, it's a serious disorder, but it's also kind of I don't want to say a badge of honor, but a way to look at yourself and know that you survived things that other people wouldn't. And I think about that a lot.
Tell me a story, I wanna hear it. You might think it's boring, but I'm interested. Tell me a story, I wanna hear it. You might think it's boring, but I'm interested.